Compressing the individual sources in your sound mix going to your stream or your podcast or your recording improves both the live and recorded sound. So this is something that can be incorporated into the live mix and then fed out into your submixer, which is adding the ambient microphones, and then into your streaming or recording equipment. Now, to do this with analog consoles, the traditional sound consoles that many churches still use, it involves quite a bit of outboard equipment, outboard compressors, when you start compressing individual channels. If you've graduated or soon plan to graduate to digital consoles, the good news with them is that this capability in most of them is built into each channel, so that you don't have to you don't have to connect any outboard equipment using extra patch cables and things like that and making kind of a messier appearance. The capability is all built into almost all digital consoles to perform this within the console itself. The capability is in there the day you buy the console. It's built in. Finally, the fourth enhancement, and this is what we do at our church, split all individual audio sources and use a separate audio console for record broadcast compared to the console that you're using for live in auditorium use. Okay? Why is this good? Well, immediately both consoles are totally independent of one another. It makes it a lot easier for the operator to set a different balance on the record, podcast, or streaming console than might be done on the live auditorium console itself. In other words, it lets the operators optimize each mix to the application they're doing. As I mentioned earlier in one of the earlier segments, it's quite possible that an element that might not even be turned up at all in the house audio console, something such as drums or whatever, might need to be turned up a good bit to be heard adequately in the console that is going to be feeding the stream or the podcast. Now, I'm showing on the screen here a screen capture of a waveform from the program that I use to process podcasts and streaming. The vertical green lines, as they vary in height, illustrate different volume levels, and as you see in this first example, there's quite a bit of variation there. In some spots, the green is very tall from top to bottom. That indicates a louder sound. And then in other areas, the area of green waveform is not nearly as tall. That's a softer sound. And again, to get consistency of volume for our listener, that's not desirable. So we want to process the sound, and I'm going to show you in another screenshot here what a little bit of processing with compression and software can do. Here's a waveform that is much more consistent in height. And you see this looks a lot more like a box or a filled-in rectangle. And what that represents is a much more consistent volume to the listener or viewer in the podcast or the stream. And that's very desirable, to keep that volume very constant for those folks. So you've got to decide whether you want to podcast, stream, or do both. Okay? If you're going to podcast, a big advantage of podcasting is that people can subscribe to it and can get updates automatically once they subscribe. Listeners receive new podcasts automatically under that kind of scenario. Podcasts are periodic, not continuous. In fact, they're usually on demand. People play them on demand as they want to hear them. And listeners subscribe at your website. Typically, they have to go to your website in order to podcast.